After an awesome weekend spent hiking Carnarvon Gorge in outback Australia, we returned to our van, ready to make tracks back to the beautiful Queensland coastline. When we swung open the rear doors, we were aghast to find a river of dried blood coating the floor of the van. Tracing the spill back to its source, we found that it was not blood but a package of liquid beef stock with one tiny corner expertly chewed through. We also came to find teeny bits and pieces of food and mouse poo scattered throughout the car. It seemed a tiny visitor had helped himself to a little of everything on offer in our pantry. After cleaning up the mess, we set off laughing at the midnight feast the little fella had enjoyed, presumably before returning to its mouse family and little mouse house. We did not suspect that this particularly ghastly vagrant mouse had no family, no house, and we now had a stowaway aboard. That night, as we drifted off to sleep, Kelly whispered urgently at me, "What's that noise?" A faint scratching could be heard from inside the car as the stowaway emerged for another midnight rampage. Without a mouse trap on board, I began to setting up a variety of contraptions and devices a la Tom and Jerry, using pots, pans, pens, and string. Any zany mousetrap idea my half-asleep brain could come up with. Meanwhile, Kelly repacked all the food she could into mouse-proof containers, and the rest we took to bed with us to protect from the home invader. It was now 1 a.m. and we had to be up for work in 4 hours. Despite how tired we were, we found ourselves waking up every 15 minutes, certain we could hear the home invader rustling around in our drawers and cupboards. The next day, having checked my pots and pans, only to find them empty, it was off to get real mousetrap from the hardware store. The woman at the hardware store recommended cheap sticky pads to catch the mouse. Perfect, I thought naively. The sticky trap will stop the mouse in its tracks, and in the morning I will be able to free it back into the wild. How humane. That night we baited the new trap with popcorn, a mouse favorite judging by the number of kernels spread throughout the vehicle, loaded up our bed once again with all the foods we couldn't mouse-proof, crawled into bed next to the groceries, switched off the lights and waited. We didn't have to wait long before the scratching of the mouse let us know that the mouse was on the prowl. We waited a few more minutes until his panicked squeaks informed us that the trap was sprung. Aha! I screamed at my vanquished foe, switching on the light and jumping out of bed. My triumph was fleeting as I saw a poor mouse tied up in knots, with its head, fur, feet, and tail all stuck to the glue trap. This mouse was not getting free from the trap. Guiltily I carried the trap and tiny mouse to a trash can nearby and closed the lid. Back in bed I felt relief but very sorry for how we'd gone about catching the mouse. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, it was almost as if I could hear our little friend again, scratching away through the car. In fact, I could swear I could hear a mouse. There were of course more mice in the house. We had only bought one trap, and that trap was now at the bottom of a trash can. We spent another night being terrorized by wild vermin. Day 3 of the mouse house standoff saw us back in the hardware, this time to find real spring-loaded traps that would end the mice brutally but quickly. That night we prepared for siege one final time. Groceries were loaded into the bed, traps were laid, and the pantomime of going to bed was staged once more. Late in the night, we took out the last 2 intruders, and finally fell into a deep restful sleep. I love to get out into nature, but I don't have any company for this, and I have to go alone. I'll tell you about one of these trips now. It was summer. I left the office happy, having received a 2-week vacation from my boss. Looking forward to a great trip, I loaded everything I needed into the car and hit the road. The road was long. I did not expect to travel such a long distance in one day. I didn't take a tent with me because I could easily sleep in the car, folding out the front passenger seat. After 6 hours of driving on an almost straight road, I began to fall asleep. We had to find a place where we could park the car and spend the night in it. I didn't want to be on the side of the road, and it was impossible. I had to find some clearing, and around there was only forest and forest. I drove another 10 kilometers and suddenly noticed an exit from the road to the village. I was very surprised, because who would live or build a dachi in such a wilderness? There are 200 kilometers to the nearest city. However, this village made me very happy, but after a few minutes my joy subsided. The village turned out to be abandoned. No, it was not destroyed, but abandoned. It looked as if all its inhabitants had left it about 3 months ago. But this did not stop me. In general, there was nowhere else to spend the night, and I parked the car near this village in a small clearing, surrounded on almost all sides by dense impenetrable forest. Having unfolded the passenger seat and sat down on it, I went to bed. However, my sleep did not last long. At about 3 in the morning, I heard a knock on the car window. A little chilled, I turned to the glass. The thoughts in my head were confused. Opening my eyes, I saw this. A strange creature was knocking on my window. His head looked like a stump that they started sawing, but not finishing it completely. They left it there. Its jaws opened almost 180 degrees, its mouth filled with yellow and sharp teeth. The skin was pale, the eyes were yellow, and the pupil in them was narrow and red. Instead of a nose, there were 2 holes. It was then that I experienced a feeling that I will remember for the rest of my life. Feeling of hopelessness. I couldn't do anything. If I get out of the car, I will only become an easier prey. I'll remain lying in a stupor. It will break the flimsy car window and get me. Then I was controlled by panic. I don't even remember when I decided to get into the driver's seat and try to get away from the monster, but that's exactly what I did. The engine roared, and in a panic I rushed on my iron horse, far away from this damn village. However, the monster did not want to give up and ran after the car. I pressed the gas to the floor and drove as fast as I could, but the monster did not lag behind. It ran on all fours and slowly caught up with the car. It was already a meter from the car when I noticed a turn, which, fortunately, turned out to be an insurmountable obstacle for the monster. I pressed the gas until I reached the nearest town, and there I already booked a hotel room. I had nightmares about how that monster finally caught up with me and ate me. I woke up in a cold sweat when it was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Somehow I got up and went on to my relatives, but on the way I was afraid of everything in the world. Fortunately, I was returning back by a different route, not through the forest. Already at home, I remembered the DVR that was in the car and recorded everything that happened. Honestly, I didn't want to see what happened that night, because even remembering it was terrible. However, curiosity overcame fear, and I pulled out the memory card from the recorder and inserted it into the computer. Having rewinded the video to the right moment, I saw the monster running out of the forest. I was surprised. How was it able to overcome the impenetrable thickets? But the worst thing awaited me ahead. At the moment where I was leaving the village in panic, the video recorder recorded a decomposed corpse, gnawed almost to the bones, in the window of a nearby house on a table in the center of the room. No, the villagers did not leave. Death overtook them right in their own homes. God, I almost went crazy at that moment, but somehow he was able to cope with the madness and began to live on, not thinking about the abandoned village that had become the abode of the monster. There is little mysticism in this story. but it is pure truth. It was 2 years ago. My relatives and I were going to the dacha. There was a small house. There was not enough space. We mainly came for fishing, but my late grandfather, may he rest in heaven, loved him very much, raised an apiary there, and there were beehives. We arrived late, somewhere between 01.00 and 03.00. At this time, of course, it was stupid to go fishing. We decided who would sleep where. There was little space, as I already said. 3 people lay down in the house. 1 was on the floor. I didn't lie down there. I decided to sleep in the car. So we said goodnight to everyone and went to bed. I got into the car, listened to the radio for a bit, and for about 30 minutes I couldn't fall asleep. But then I didn't even notice how I fell asleep. I hear a knock, as if someone is knocking on glass. I thought, friends, who else could there be? Stood up, and everything became quiet, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to fall asleep again, but I no longer wanted to sleep at all and was tormented and tossing and turning. I heard the sound of a smoker, as if someone was smoking behind the house. I didn't get up, but wanted to fall asleep quickly. Time passed, I still couldn't fall asleep, and the sound of the smoker kept ringing in my ears. I decided to go out, smoke, and at the same time see what was behind the house. That sound was coming from there. As soon as I opened the door, everything went quiet. I ignored this sound and, opening the door slightly, smoked a cigarette. Before I had time to close the door, the sound of a smoker began to sound as if right outside the door. I tried to fall asleep, but I couldn't. The sound was getting closer. I got out of the car and went into the house to sleep. Lay down on the floor, and I hear the sound of water, as if someone turned on a faucet. I got up and went to the kitchen, but there was no one there. Before I could get into bed, I heard heavy footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one. I was lying there trying to sleep, and I heard a sound like someone tearing paper, and suddenly the plaster fell. First she fell on a harness, and then on me. It was like this for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Water was running, footsteps, a sound as if someone was tearing paper. Then I fell asleep, and I already woke up in a very bad mood. I get to and from work every day by tram. In our city, electric transport is going through hard times. During the heyday of tram traffic in Saratov, there were 3 depots. The depot opened around the mid-1980s. A line was even opened for passenger traffic to it. It was actively used by residents of surrounding houses. Due to this, Tramroute No. 11 was extended. The final stop was moved from the Geological College to Depot No. 3, and this is several kilometers more. After the terrorist attack, the tram depot did not operate for long and was abandoned in the early 2000s. Tram number 11 began to turn around at its old terminus, at the Geological College. The rails and wires from it to the depot were partially dismantled over time. I use this tram every weekday. The fact that the route has been shortened doesn't bother me much. I have to get off a few stops before college, but one day I passed my stop. It's been a terribly tough week at work. By Friday evening I felt like a lemon. Sleepless nights took their toll. It seemed to me that I could fall asleep even standing up. Since I had to be late at work, I rode home in a half-empty tram. Well, good, I thought, making myself more comfortable on the seat by the window. The conductor came up. I paid the fare and immediately fell asleep to the rhythmic sound of the tram wheels. I woke up because the driver was announcing over the microphone. The train has arrived at the final stop. The composition does not go further. Please vacate the carriage. There was no one in the carriage except me. Even the conductor had disappeared somewhere. Nothing was visible outside the windows of the tram. It gets dark early in late autumn. I got out of the car and decided to wait until the tram left, since I had to cross to the other side and then go back to my stop. The tram left, but I froze in place. It turned out that they brought me not to the final stop Geological College at all, but to an abandoned depot. I understood this from the outlines of dilapidated buildings and sleepers scattered in a chaotic manner. I had previously read on the internet about the abandoned Lenin depot and seen photographs of what remained of the tram depot, so I recognized the place. I've never been so scared before. Not even because I ended up somewhere I couldn't get to purely theoretically. After all, The rails were dismantled and the wires were cut. But because I was afraid of meeting the watchmen or security guards there, I'm sure they wouldn't be impressed by the story of how the tram brought me to the depot, which stopped working 10 years ago. They would take me for an ordinary lover of easy money. For example, those who steal and sell metal. In a panic, I rushed around the depot area, trying not to make any noise, and eventually ran out into the illuminated street. How I managed to do this, I have no idea. It was purely an accident. Noticing a sign on the first private house I came across, I called a taxi to the indicated address. While the car was on the way, I did not move a single step from the gate. 10 minutes later, which seemed like an eternity to me, the taxi arrived. Soon I was already home, but despite the fatigue, I was able to fall asleep only in the morning. All night on the internet I looked for information about this abandoned tram line and the ghost tram. The next day, I walked around the area and became convinced that I definitely would not have been able to get to the depot by tram for the simple reason that there were no rails, and the enterprising Saratov residents had already removed the tram poles and adapted them to their needs. This incident forever discouraged me from sleeping on public transport. You never know where the fallen passenger will end up. The wheels knock at the joints, the carriage shakes slightly. A dim night lamp sometimes flickers, causing an unpleasant impact on tired eyes. There's nothing to be done. The damn business trip just happened out of the blue. I had to take the first available ticket to Veliky Novgorod and hit the road at night. All the passengers were asleep, and I quietly took my place on the top bunk and began working on the next project. There was deathly silence, except that the musical crack of a laptop keyboard diluted the oppressive atmosphere of the old reserved seat. The houses outside the window thinned out, leaving the speeding train alone with the frightening forest and me alone with my work laptop. The work wasn't going well, so I increasingly looked blankly out the window, observing the same landscape of gloomy winter. Suddenly the train made a sharp jolt. The brakes squealed and the speed began to drop rapidly. I wanted to reassure myself and think that this was some kind of stop in the middle of the forest, but this idea did not fit into the excessively sharp braking. Strange, but only my neighbor, lying on the next shelf, woke up. "Oh damn, what happened here? It looks like an emergency stop," I stated with strange obviousness. "Okay, I'll go and have a look now." My new acquaintance, whose name I did not know, reluctantly fell out of his seat, put on his shoes, and making sure that the conductor was not there, sent him somewhere outside the carriage. With every minute of downtime, I began to worry more and more. The neighbor did not return, and no one canceled the plans. This morning I was supposed to be at a conference on problems in the construction industry, and then there was this ambush of unknown origin. The heavy silence got on my nerves, and therefore I was only glad of the approaching steps. As it turned out, it was my neighbor who returned. "Guy, get up, we need your help." "What's happened?" I asked, already whistling under the empty lower bed in search of shoes. "There are no guides. The passengers sleep as if they were all on sleeping pills." I looked out the window, but I couldn't see a thing. "Help me open the carriage door. I want to get out and figure out what the hell is going on." While I was putting on my coat, a neighbor, whose name, as it turned out, was Roman, tried to wake up one of our fellow travelers. That's when I first noticed this poor guy. The man lay motionless, his face buried in the wall. The dark green blanket hid almost the entire body. The protruding head seemed incredibly dirty, as if it contained pieces of earth. Then I did not give it any importance, thinking about the errors of perception under the pallor of the night lighting of the carriage. "The train doesn't go any further. The train doesn't go any further. The train doesn't go any further," he repeated continuously. In the end, Roman got tired of snapping his fingers in front of his strange fellow traveler, and he told me, "To hell with him. He's some kind of crazy person." Roman said quietly, "Let's go together, since everyone here is sleeping so soundly." He said much louder so that everyone could hear, and off we went. Behind a long corridor, a vestibule appeared, and behind it another carriage and another vestibule. The guides really were nowhere to be found, nor were there any interested people. The bodies lay on shelves, wrapped in winter blankets. However, there was a certain lifelessness in all this. I tried not to allow this thought, but it didn't work. "It's like they're dead," I thought and whispered to Roma. He nodded in response. I have watched many times how conductors open the door of the carriage and lower the steps, and therefore there were no difficulties with this. The key hung helpfully on a loop. The bolt gave way easily. I don't think I need to say that curiosity overcame me just like Roman, and so the two of us got out of the car. Yes, we definitely weren't crazy. They go crazy alone, but not together. We both saw a strange picture that only bothered us. The locomotive simply stood there, without any obstacles in front of it. There were no traces of people or anything to explain the situation. I climbed the steps and looked into the driver's cab. It won't come as a surprise if I say that it was empty. The entire staff seemed to have disappeared, leaving the sleeping passengers alone, with an eerie forest stretching in all directions to the horizon. Listen, I don't feel at ease here, Roman admitted, and I nodded in response, sharing the emotions of a random neighbor. What to do? I asked dryly, but Roman didn't have time to answer. For the first time during the entire trip, we heard a sound that came not from ourselves, but from someone else. Something similar to a bang happened right next to us, somewhere in the middle of the third carriage. We, without hesitation, climbed onto the train and walked to that very place. My hands are shaking in anticipation of describing the horror that we had to face. The same sound. It repeated itself again, and even increased in strength. The sound is not a pop, but a blow. The man, who looked barely able to stand, lowered the dagger into the body of another man. My eyes had already adapted to the darkness, and I was able to see all the disgustingness of this. No, not a person, creature. The vile creature with a blade in its hands looked more like a living dead. His knife plunged into the same disfigured body of rotting flesh from scraps of earth. Other passengers with the same appearance also stood up. They made gurgling sounds, almost hissing at each other. Without hesitation, they all rushed to strangle their own kind, tearing them with their claws and black teeth. Of course, our eyes refused to believe the madness that was going on in the carriage, and therefore we simply backed away, noticing all the great trembling in our legs and arms. And so, when the slimy viper of fear had already made its way deep into the consciousness, Roman finally shouted, "Let's run." I heard his words. I even turned around and started to run, but only with my back. I felt like a chase was starting after me. Several disgusting creatures abandoned their personal enmity in order to destroy us, the only living ones who inexplicably ended up on the train of madness. The instinct of self-preservation led us away from the train. Quickly finding myself in the vestibule, with shaking hands I tried to cope with the bolt, and Roman tried to hold the end door, which the living dead were breaking into. Finally, the latch gave way and the door opened. We just flew out of the car. Inertia threw me to my knees, but I, simply denying the pain, immediately stood up and rushed headlong into the forest. Roman did not lag behind. The pursuers were not far behind. They managed to wave their arms and make terrible screams. I was too shocked to notice anything other than my increased heart rate, so I couldn't even think about where we were even running. What kind of rescue can you expect in a wild forest area? Gradually, roughness appeared in my throat, and my eyes grew dark. I no longer saw or heard anything. I just ran headlong towards the light that appeared in front of me. First, the contours began to be visible, and then the entire silhouette. It was a bend in the road, and the light was the headlights of one of the passing cars. The car passed, but the next one appeared almost immediately behind it. We were lucky. The driver sharply pressed the brakes, and I, and then Roman, fell into the car with one sharp jerk. After catching our breath, coming to our senses, and driving to a safe distance, we finally received the first question from the driver. "Are you by any chance train passengers?" "How do you know?" Roma exclaimed with surprise and alarm. "So I travel here often and have already picked up crazy people like you a couple of times. That month there was a guy who claimed that some creatures had eaten his girlfriend. And that week, somewhere in the same area, I picked up 2 men, severely wounded and exhausted. Everyone is saying the same nonsense about some train that is not going any further." Roma and I looked at each other, recognizing in the reflection of these stories our own, albeit distorted, destinies. "I don't know, guys, where you get such weirdos from and what kind of fly agarics you eat in the forest, but within a radius of 50 kilometers there is no railway, and even more so, there are no trains. Complete forest and wilderness." This story happened to a friend of mine. He lives in Minsk. As children, when we met more often, we sometimes talked about paranormal topics. We haven't really seen each other for about 10 years. We've crossed paths several times, and we've also corresponded on the internet. And then one day we were traveling home on the same train. It wasn't crowded, and on the long way home he told me a story. One day my friend was driving home from work on the subway. There weren't very many people in the carriage, but still all the seats were occupied. He sat down opposite the seats, holding the handrail, and thought about something of his own. I ran my eyes over the announcements and advertisements hung in the designated places, looked at the passengers, crossed my life with the life of the beauty sitting opposite, dreamed about what could have happened if, thought about what he would do in the evening. In general, I tried to take up the travel time as best I could. Then he stared out the window. The walls of the tunnel flashed behind him and the passengers sitting behind him were reflected. My friend began to look at them. Here is an elderly, stately man sitting. He behaves well for his age. Here are female students going to university. He is just on the way. Here is a citizen with a bunch of bags and luggage, hung with them, like a shuttleman in the old days. But who is this? Some strange guy, dressed in a decrepit gray coat. The skin is also somehow dark, a stupid hat with a brim, and he also looks straight into the reflection, straight into the eyes. My friend did not look away. He began to rummage around the stranger with his eyes. His face was thin, elongated, massive cheekbones, sunken eyes, stubble, a wide and large nose. He kept looking and looking straight into his eyes through the reflection in the glass of the subway car. And then something happened that made my friend remember for many years that our world is not so simple. The stranger's face began to distort. His jaw slid down, his mouth opened wider than possible, 2 to 3 times. His jaws began to move in different directions. His mouth became twisted, and his eyes still looked at my friend. The comrade shuddered. He did not understand what was happening, although for a moment he thought that it was all due to distortion in a curved glass of the subway. The comrade turned sharply, and something happened that made his legs give way. Cold sweat appeared, and his eyes went dark. There was no one in the place of the strange passenger. There was an empty place there. The friend instantly turned and stared at the reflection. There was no creepy fellow traveler there either. The stranger had disappeared. After this incident, an acquaintance of mine, according to his stories, was terribly afraid to look into reflections in the subway, and even into mirrors. He said that he was bending over the sink at the wash basin to wash his face, and when he raised his head, he was involuntarily afraid to look in the mirror, so as not to see there's something just as scary there. It's been 3 years since that incident, but apparently it was a stressful incident. Since I noticed minor but noticeable changes in my friend's behavior, I became more twitchy and wary. I don't know how true the story is, but having heard it firsthand, I never doubted it, because it was told so emotionally that it was easy to believe in it.